Today we're going to look at suffering, what it means to suffer, and what it means to be free of suffering, or at the very least to reduce the amount of suffering that we experience in life. And I'm going to share with you 3 steps or methods to deal with suffering when it arises. Before we go into all of this, we first have to understand the difference between pain and suffering, because these 2 words are often used interchangeably as if they mean the same thing. But at least in the way that I use them, there's a distinct difference. Pain is a sensation of the body, whereas suffering is a disturbance in the mind. So one is a physical phenomenon and the other is purely psychological. And although they may often seem to be related because often we experience them simultaneously, we also can experience them completely independent of one another. That is, you can experience physical pain without mental suffering, and you can suffer emotionally even when there's no physical pain. So what makes them distinctly different is that while pain is often unavoidable, suffering is entirely optional. That is, we can't always control whether we experience pain, but we have some control over whether or not we suffer. So what exactly is suffering? Well, all suffering is a form of resistance. And when I talk about resistance, I'm only talking about a psychological phenomenon. We're not talking about physically resisting anything. We're talking only in terms of the mind. Now, the resistance might be in regard to something occurring outside of the mind, in the physical experience, but the resistance itself is entirely psychological. Resistance simply means you refuse to accept what's happening, which is a kind of insanity when you think about it, because whatever is happening, whether you accept it or not. If it's raining and you refuse to accept that it's raining, it's still raining regardless of whether or not you accept it. Your unwillingness to accept does nothing at all to stop it from raining. But what it does do is it creates a disturbance in the mind, a tension, a conflict between what you want and what is actually occurring in reality. And that disturbance is what we call suffering. So the more we resist what is, the more we experience suffering. And the more we experience suffering, the more difficult it is to perceive reality as it is, because the mind becomes clouded, and this obscures our perception. And the whole thing can become so overwhelming to the point that our suffering seems to permeate our entire experience. When suffering becomes persistent, it can be very difficult to see ourselves as anything other than the sufferer. It becomes a part of our identity, that we're always suffering in one way or another. And when we assume that identity, it can seem impossible to escape it. So the first thing we have to do is to disidentify with our suffering. And what do I mean by that? Pay attention to the way we talk about suffering. We often say things like, I am angry, I am depressed, I am unhappy, I am suffering. The phrase I am means to be. It means to identify as. So when we say I am suffering, we're identifying as the suffering. But you are not the suffering. Suffering is something occurring within your experience, but it's distinctly different from who you are. Think of it in this sense. Sometimes you experience happiness. Sometimes you experience unhappiness. These feelings come and go. They're always changing. They're transient, temporary. But the one experiencing these feelings is always the same, unchanging, constant. To experience something there must be the experiencer and the experience. Or to put it another way, to be aware of something, of anything, there must be the awareness and the object of awareness. That is, the thing that is being observed and the one who is observing it. These are two distinctly different things. So when there is suffering, are you aware of it? And if you are, this means there is suffering, and there is the one who is aware of suffering. You are that awareness, and suffering is a phenomenon occurring within your mind, within your psychological experience. Just as everything else occurring within your experience is not who you are, but only a passing phenomenon. So it's important to understand this because it's very easy to get so caught up in the suffering that we identify with it, that we don't distinguish between ourselves and the suffering. And as long as we identify as our suffering, we find it virtually impossible to be free of it. So be aware of this, and be aware that everything occurring within your experience is transient. That means coming and going. But you, the observer, remains constantly the same, which means anything in your experience is temporary. It's not who you are. It's just a temporary phenomenon. So when suffering arises in our experience, what do? How should we deal with it? When suffering arises, naturally we don't want to suffer. We want to be rid of it, and we'll do whatever we can to try and get rid of it. We try all kinds of things, but ultimately nothing seems to work. Often the best we can do is distract ourselves, and we may get some relief for a little while. But then we find ourselves suffering once again. Or it may be that under certain circumstances, we can't even seem to distract ourselves. The suffering is so persistent and overwhelming that there seems to be nothing that we can do to escape it. So the first thing is to simply allow it to be there, not to fight or struggle against it, not to try and push it away or bury it, not to try and distract ourselves or to escape from it, but to simply allow it to be there, in some sense to surrender to the suffering. Now, this may seem counterintuitive and even counterproductive. It may seem that if we allow suffering to be there in our experience without trying to do anything about it, then it's just going to be there. It's not going to leave us alone. It's not going to go away. It seems to reason that if we simply allow suffering to be there without doing anything about it, then we'll never be free of it. But this is the paradox, that when we surrender to the experience of suffering, suffering actually diminishes. Now, how is that? Remember that suffering is a form of resistance. So when we resist suffering, we're actually compounding it, increasing it. When we're resisting resistance, we're adding more resistance to the resistance that we're already experiencing. So the more we resist suffering, the more we suffer. Resistance again means the unwillingness to accept what is. So if we want to be free from suffering, we have to begin by accepting. We have to accept what is, whatever is occurring within our experience, and that includes the suffering itself. What exactly does it mean to accept? There's a lot of ways that we interpret that word, and some of those interpretations are inaccurate, but to accept simply means to drop our resistance, to let go. And that's all that there is to it. It's just letting go of resistance. So to accept the suffering just means to drop our resistance to it, simply allowing it to be there and surrendering to that experience. And when we move into a state of surrender, it's a state of relaxation, because there's no resistance, no pushing, no struggling, no fighting, no pulling away from or trying to run away. All of that is an exertion of energy. So to let go of resistance, to surrender to the moment, to the experience, including the experience of suffering, is to stop exerting energy. When you surrender, you become relaxed, because what is relaxation but a state in which no energy is being exerted? So when you become relaxed, no longer generating resistance, which again is suffering, even the suffering you're already experiencing begins to decrease. And the more you relax into it, the more it decreases. Once you begin to relax into the moment, whatever suffering is there, just be aware of it and begin to observe it. Remember that suffering is the object of your awareness, not who you are. So you are the awareness observing the object of awareness. In this case, observing the suffering, which just means looking at it, noticing it, examining it. And by observing it in this way, we can come to understand it, to understand what it is, how it arises, what is at the root of it, and so on. Now, I've already explained what suffering is to some degree, and perhaps you understand that explanation. But to really understand deeply, you have to observe all of this yourself. It's not enough to have someone else's explanation. It's not enough to understand it logically and intellectually. You have to have some experiential understanding, and that requires observation. So to observe in a very objective way, not being identified with what we're observing, not being entangled with it or attached to it, but disidentifying with it, detaching from it, taking a step back, and then observing it as a phenomenon occurring within the space of our experience, as something apart from oneself. Emotions, whether pleasant or unpleasant, are all transient. They come and they go, like clouds moving across the sky. So to observe them in the mind, in the same way that you would observe clouds drifting across the sky, you're just the observer, watching, noticing. You're not trying to push the clouds away. You're not holding on to them. You're simply watching. And the more you come to understand suffering, what it actually is, how it arises, where it arises from, seeing it as a passing phenomenon, no longer identifying with it, the more you become free from it, and the less it arises. If you find this content valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.